and the American University in Cairo, it is a great pleasure to welcome Professor Étienne Balibar and our guests to the 20th Edward Said Memorial Lecture. I'm filling in for my colleague, Professor Philosopher, who could not be here to introduce personally our distinguished speaker, but she is joining us online. Edward Said was a frequent visitor to Egypt and was invited to lecture as a distinguished university professor on several occasions at AUC. When he passed away, our department, with the support of the AUC administration, founded a series of annual Edward Said Memorial Lectures. The speakers who have delivered the Edward Said Memorial Lectures in the past include David Damrosch, Barbara Harlow, Cornel West, Terry Eagleton, Rochus de Groot, Judith Butler, John Carlos Rowe, Michael Wood, Sari Maqdisi, Marina Warner, Lila Abou-Lughod, Suleiman Dian, Usama Maqdisi, Robert Young, Wadia Said, Raja Shahada, Noam Chomsky, Timothy Brennan, and Richard Falk. I now turn to my colleague, Professor Robert Switzer from the Department of Philosophy at AUC, who will introduce Professor Balibar.
Thank you very much, Tahia. And everyone, welcome to this evening's Edward Said Memorial Lecture, featuring a talk, as you know, from our distinguished guest, Professor Étienne Balibar. His talk will be titled Geometries of Imperialism in the 21st Century. As we just heard from Professor Abdel Nasser, this is the latest in a very illustrious series of talks. But if you'll indulge me, I'd like to begin by going back even before the series began. And that is to something that was a singular and great honor, perhaps matched by none in my academic career. And that was introducing Edward Said himself on one of, in fact, his last visit to AUC. It was in March 2023. I was chair of the department at that time, which may seem odd since I'm in philosophy, but at that point, English and comparative literature and philosophy were united. An arrangement that frankly made a lot of sense to me, given my undergraduate work at the University of Toronto with a dual degree and my ongoing interests in both fields. So, in fact, I was very at home with that arrangement and still think that we remain very close. There are two things I recall above all about that evening. One, well, in addition to Professor Edward Said's incredible brilliance, his charm, and amazingly enough, his modesty, given everything that he accomplished. But when we walked into Ewart Hall, which is just down this way on this campus, the electricity was unbelievable. I felt like I was accompanying a rock star. It was a really powerful moment. And the second thing is that in my introduction, I highlighted the fact that we were gathering on the eve of war. And I was unintentionally prophetic because the very next morning, the US invasion of Iraq began. We gather now also in the shadow of war with genocidal intent only a couple of 100 kilometers away, and also on the eve, more or less, of another likely cataclysm as the American system undertakes biannual rites of what passes there, less and less convincingly, I think, as democracy. And where the outcome in terms of war and peace, and precisely in terms of both ongoing and new expressions of imperialism, remains unknown. And in this sense, Professor Balibar's talk could not be more timely. It's impossible, I think, to give a short introduction to Professor Étienne Balibar. To even attempt to do so is to leave far too much unsaid from a career that spans 6 decades. In the 1960s, he undertook studies at the École Normale Supérieure, where he worked closely with Althusser in a collaboration that resulted in the celebrated Reading Marx, published in English in 1970. He earned higher degrees from the Catholic University Nijmegen and the University of Paris I, has been awarded several honorary degrees, and has taken up, among others, appointments as professor of the University of Paris 10 at Nanterre, and distinguished professor of French and comparative literature at the University of California, Irvine, Columbia in New York City, and Kingston University in London. Professor Balibar is the author of some 40 books, most of which have been translated into a range of languages, and over 200 articles. Among his many works that have appeared in English, let me highlight a few. The invaluable overview, The Philosophy of Marx, 1995, and then reissued in 2017. Masses, Classes, Ideas, Studies in Politics and Philosophy from 1994. Politics and the Other Scene from 2002. Important works on Spinoza and John Locke. We the People of Europe, ? Reflections on Transnational Citizenship, 2003, and Secularism and Cosmopolitanism from 2018. In his 2017 introduction to the philosophy of Marx, he writes that from his early Althusserian Marxism to today, with all that has transpired intellectually and historically, he still shares, he confesses, quote, the hope for emancipation. And on that note of hope in these dark times, without further ado, Professor Étienne Balibar.
My turn. With all my... Oh, can you hear me well? Yes. Okay. Hope I can read my text because I have terribly bad eyes these days, but we'll see. It's an enormous pleasure to be visiting Cairo for the first time in my life, probably the last as well, and speaking tonight at AUC. Allow me to begin with several heartfelt thanks. They go, first of all, to the university and the Department of English and Comparative Literature, who invited me, to the department's chair, Professor Tahia Abdel Nasser, and to Professor Robert Switzer, who just introduced me in such a warm and generous manner. They go also on behalf of my wife, Françoise, who is here tonight with us, to the department staff, including Omneya Ali and Ola Shanab, for an incredibly generous support and help in organizing our trip. I have special feelings of gratitude and sympathy for our dear colleague, Professor Ferri Al-Khazul, who initiated the whole process and is not able to join us in person tonight, as was already said, to our common regret. I know that she's there online, and I send her my warmest wishes. I also want to greet Mariam Said, who wrote to me a few days ago that she would have made the trip to attend the lecture in person if the current war in Gaza and Lebanon did not make it impossible. She's with us online as well, I believe. Thank you so much, Mariam, with all my gratitude for your continuous friendship in the memory of Edward. It is an extraordinary honor and a challenge to be presenting this memorial lecture after so many prestigious scholars and writers, and to be doing it now, in dramatic circumstances to which I will come. I derived my somewhat bizarre title from a little-known structuralist essay, The Geometry of Imperialism, published in 1978, same year as Orientalism, a coincidence, by the late Giovanni Arrighi, one of the founding figures of the School of the Development of Underdevelopment, with the great Egyptian economist and sociologist Samir Amin and others, and a major contributor to our understanding of the variations of imperialism from a post-Marxist point of view. I will not repeat him or argue exactly in the same lines. Isn't that too loud? No, it's okay? Okay. But I too will try to articulate a reflection on the complexity of the phenomenon that we call imperialism, its centrality in modern world history, and its transformations in the last period, where the importance of Edward Said's contribution can be located and, I believe, well explained. Inevitably, my presentation will simplify some conceptual issues and skip important debates. Perhaps this is also a way to direct our attention, our conversation, towards the issues that in the present I find most urgent and also difficult. This presentation is essentially a piece of theoretical reflection, but which involves, or so I hope, a militant commitment to anti-imperialist struggles with all their diversity and their problematic unity, which harbor our hopes to become, remain, and act as conscious subjects of our own collective emancipation from violence and exploitation. In my conclusion, I will formulate some hypotheses about the orientations of such struggles and hopes on the basis of an updated picture of the structure of domination that for 500 years now has structured our world and seems now to be precipitating it towards a planetary catastrophe. They will remain, these hypotheses, far too abstract, I am afraid. However, even in this modality, proposals of resistance and emancipation are never independent of the circumstances, the place and time of their enunciation. These today are nothing but tragic, and I'm deeply aware of that as I speak in Cairo under the inspiration of Edward Said. I cannot not be obsessed by the images and news of the war of expulsion and extermination waged by Israel in Palestine and now Lebanon in barbaric forms. And I'm haunted by the question why the world, also called the international community, endorses it or proves unable to stop it. This is immediately related to our subject, since Israel is clearly a sub-imperialism organically linked to the dominant imperialism, the US imperialism, or even forming part of it, but also, strangely, or not so strangely, able to impose their strategy upon their master and protector in order to carry on their specific colonial project called Zionism. It is also impossible that my discourse, following on a long, not only French, but particularly French tradition of Le Voyage en Orient, not be governed by the perception of the uniqueness of this country and this vast region centered on the Nile Valley, the Red Sea, and the Levant, both in terms of its contribution to civilization and its dramatic experiences of violence. This is a region where, since the very beginnings of what we call history, powerful empires have been struggling for hegemony. As I will argue in a moment, modern imperialism, with all its novelty, is a moment in that history. Throughout the 20th century, today more than ever, the region was the object of the strategic conflict between imperialist powers, but it was also home to revolutionary insurrections, with courageous leaders and peoples standing up to reverse the course of history and imagine a different future, only too often to become crushed by overwhelming internal and external forces. You may guess with which emotion I'm speaking today on Tahrir Place or immediately close to it. And not to avoid the most tragic note, this is a region where, in the recent years, no less than 3 genocidal massacres have taken place in Darfur, in Syria, today in Gaza. To discuss imperialism here and now, for me, is not just historiography. I come to my first point, concentrating on the articulation of imperialism and different forms of war. Let me explain why. After the founding essays in the early 20th century by Hobson, Hilferding, Rosa Luxemburg, Kautsky, Lenin, theories of imperialism never ceased to change. There is no final theory. There are, however, periodic returns to certain classical divides, such as the renewal of Luxemburg's idea of the violent expropriation of peasants in the colonial periphery in, for example, David Harvey's recent explanation of the new imperialism as, I quote, accumulation by dispossession. And there is a permanent tension between theories where the concept of imperialism fundamentally denotes a political phenomenon, and theories where it is derived from an analysis of the forms of exploitation and antagonism that are inherent in the capitalist economy. But since the beginning, this tension was crucially commended by the necessity of accounting for the emergence of war from within the fabric of a modern society whose principle of organization and progress, namely commerce, is supposed to be peaceful. It was, in Lenin's words, the imminent catastrophe of World War I that crystallized the debates around the combination of capitalism, nationalism, colonization, militarization, and war. And it was the conviction, their conviction, that this combination pushed the bourgeois society to an absolute limit that led the radical thinkers of the time to present the choice, imperialism or revolution, with the implicit assumption that imperialism generates problems for which it has no solution. I will return to this. Right now, however, I want to submit that the articulation of imperialism and war is not a particular consequence of a structural definition. In fact, it is the primordial question from which the concept arises and to which we must return in order to assess the changes, the continuities and discontinuities, the contradictory tendencies of this phenomenon. There can be nothing contingent in the articulation of imperialism and war, but there is also no such thing as a simple essence of imperialism from which the consequences, war as a consequence, would derive. In other terms, we're not just asking questions about the circumstances and effects of imperialist wars or wars in the age of imperialism. We're asking questions about the intrinsic link of war and imperialism, which remains to be fully investigated. In this respect, I will propose two hypotheses. The first hypothesis says this: imperialism in its dominant sense, more or less Marxist, which makes it inseparable from capitalism as a mode of production based on infinite accumulation of monetary value, certainly introduces a new modality of imperial conquest around the date of 1492, the symbolic beginning of the colonization of the world by European powers. But it did not interrupt the history of empires and their rivalries. Much the contrary, it gave empire as a political form a new and unprecedented vitality. Imperialism is no break with the history of empires. It makes sense only as a new moment in their very long history. Centuries, millennia. Now this could mean simply that modern imperialisms remain based on conquest and domination, and in fact are driven by the imperial dream of global power, which was clearly the case not only for the British Empire, but also for the French or American Republican empires and others. But there is more, because the political form of the empire has an intrinsic link to warfare and the institutional function of war, something that, for want of a longer discussion, I will express with the following Roman axiom. Empires continuously wage wars at their frontiers in order to make space for commerce, law, culture, in short, peace. Which means, conversely, that they invent institutions of peace in order to wage wars and prepare for them in a continuous cycle. The second, inventing institutions of peace in order to wage wars, is no less true than the first. And from a realistic point of view, it must be considered the truth of the first. War is intrinsic to imperialism as it always was to empire. Now, my second hypothesis, which is also the most important in my second hypothesis, I will combine formulas from two others who are politically absolutely antithetical, but share precisely an equally realistic view of the power struggles in the 20th century. Lenin and Carl Schmitt. At the core of Lenin's essay, famous essay, on imperialism, written in 1916, published in 1917, is the idea of the division of the world among rival powers, a division characterized by its intrinsic instability, therefore never leading to a permanent distribution of the world's parts, but immediately generating violent struggles for a redistribution. If an idea in Lenin's theory has been confirmed by history, it is certainly this one. Witness, and I abridge, the continuous series of conflicts that leads from the Berlin Conference in 1885 which distributed known and unknown parts of Africa, the so-called dark continent, among the European colonial powers, to the emergence of non-European imperialisms in America and Asia, to the two world wars, to the Cold War and its aftermath in the form of a militarized so-called liberal world order. The applicability of this idea to our current situation and the near future is certainly one of the most decisive questions that we need to examine, particularly in relation to the now very frequently invoked motto of multilateralism. But this examination calls for a broadening of the Leninist description. Lenin's emphasis was on seizing territories, as can be shown on a map of the world. Since we are speaking of empires whose power is linked with the investment and profitability of capital, the territories are not purely spatial entities. They are inseparable from the appropriation of resources to be monopolized, be they resources of energy, coal, oil, minerals and agricultural products whose exploitation transforms the environment, human resources made of populations that can be enslaved, displaced, put to work, coerced into the military, etc. But many resources could be controlled and extracted without a direct rule over the territories, provided monetary and military instruments create an overwhelming unbalance of power. This was the secret of US imperialism, thus giving the new division of the world a more abstract form, less visible on maps, if not on the ground, because it targeted territories as markets rather than colonies, and constructed an empire whose range was limited only by the global capacity of crushing insurrections and investing capitals anywhere on earth. But what we face now, strangely, is a profound transformation of the idea of the division of the world and the struggle for its new division. Because, in particular, it is no longer a question of seizing land, but a question of dividing the virtual world, call it the metaverse if you want, among rival communicational empires, a division which creates its own territories and whose masters are perhaps not so much states as multinational corporations and networks virtually independent of the states or controlling them rather than the reverse. Whether this revolutionary form of territoriality will acquire enough autonomy to relativize the struggle for hegemony that, especially between the United States and the Chinese industrial empire, seems now to structure the global order, and what kind of conflicts it will generate, these are the questions on which our future is suspended. But at this point, we need a detour through the work of Carl Schmitt. There is remarkable convergence between the Leninist idea of the division and redivision of the world and the Schmittian idea of the Landnahme or land grabbing, as developed in the book from 1950, The Nomos of the Earth in the International Law of Jus Publicum Europaeum. Nomos is an interesting Greek word word, Schmidt, as we know, play on that, which means law on one side and precisely division or distribution on the other side. Where the history of the construction of nation states in the core European countries since the end of the religious wars in the 17th century, the so-called Westphalian order, is correlated to the fact that the same nations are in perpetual war to create empires and spoil each other of their colonies. Of course, their anticipation, Lenin on one side, Schmidt on the other side, of the outcome of the crisis of the nomos is radically different. Where Lenin sees a revolution coming, Schmidt, the arch counter-revolutionary, anticipates a new geometry of imperialism in the form of regional empires or great, difficult to translate the German word, great territorial entities, Großräume, which strangely resonates with the contemporary problematic of the multipolar world and the clash of civilizations. What I find most illuminating, however, is the idea that the division of the world is not only a division of land resources, populations, land resources, populations, but also a distribution of heterogeneous forms of warfare among antithetic parts of the world. More precisely, it operates at two different levels. It is a division among imperialist states, and it is a division between what I will call, but Schmidt would not object to that, between the region of the masters and the regions of the slaves, the subjects of future subjects, what would be called later the center and the periphery. Violence waged in the center to redistribute Herrschaft, domination, and violence waged in the periphery to establish and continuously reassert the domination of the masters over the barbarians are qualitatively and quantitatively different. This is Schmidt's central argument. The second needs to be continuous, atrocious, and barbaric itself, whereas the first is intermittent and claims to be civilized and obeying the so-called laws of war. Again, the stability, hence the accuracy of this geometry is far from assured. Witness the atrocities of the world wars or what is taking place in this moment, for example, in Ukraine. But it can be used in a reverse manner. A post-Schmittian, which is also, in my opinion, a kind of counter-Schmittian view, would be that the unequal distribution of the forms of violence in the imperialist wars is exactly the mechanism that draws the frontiers separating the two worlds within the same world. And the two or more humanities, or races, as the English allows us to say, within the same humankind. This is the intrinsic figure of imperialism as a social form in an anthropological form in modern history. It was dislocated and relocated several times, and perhaps it will be again at devastating human and environmental costs. I will conclude on this point by jumping again to the questions assailing us in the present. In a world which is still divided among rival nations, states and regimes, but can be said to have reached unprecedented degrees of interdependency and ought to become aware of its vital common interests. For instance, in a pandemic or before a monetary crisis, and of course before the environmental catastrophe, illustrating oneness rather than duality or division. Where do we find the marks of empire? And how do we describe the global regime of war that characterizes the one world in which rival powers are competing in the name of antithetic values, both on the ground and in the air, that is, in the infosphere? To the first question, my tentative answer is the most savage ones, are the declining empires who feel threatened at the same time by the loss of their imperial privileges and by the demise of their image of greatness, or the other terminologies, election, manifest destiny, etc. This is illustrated by the case of Russia as it is by the case of the United States, admittedly at very different levels of imperiality. Reunite the Ruski mir, the Russian world, make America great again, etc. And my answer to the second, we have reached a stage of generalized exterminism. I borrow this name from the famous essay by Edward Palmer Thompson, Notes, the great historian, British historian, Notes on Exterminism, the Last Stage of Civilization from 1980, a title intentionally imitating Lenin's. It was written in the course of the campaign against the nuclear arms race of the Cold War, in which Thompson was a leading figure, insisting on the idea that the risk of annihilation of the planet as a livable environment for humans was not only inscribed in the imperial policies and ideologies of the two superpowers, but in the sheer magnitude of the production of arms and its importance for the economy. This remains completely true, but I believe that we can propose an extended concept of exterminism in order to describe the normalization of war, or the normalization of the state of exception that is war, affecting every part of the world in heterogeneous forms, in which I include, of course, not only the official interstate wars, such as the war in Ukraine, but also the civil wars, or so-called, and even the private wars of organized criminality, and the counter-terrorist police operations waged by states against internal and external enemies. All these forms of war have singular histories and local causes, but together they form a global distribution of armed violence which includes every degree and spares no region, no society between the two extremes, represented by actual genocides perpetrated either by racist mobs or masses, or by highly organized colonial armies, as today in Gaza. And the potential, on the other side, the potential nuclear annihilation, once already experimented against Japan. Exterminism, the newest but also the lowest stage of imperialism, this seems to be the situation in which we must try and imagine a different world. Not a very optimistic idea. Was I too long on this first point? Yes, probably. hopefully not completely, if you accept to view it as the most pressing issue in the present, especially seen from this place in the world. I will give now a summary presentation of the second point, which regards the idea of imperialism as a stage or period in the history of capitalism. Therefore, addressing the question, what form of capitalism do we today live in and live with? The Russian adjective, I don't speak Russian, Vyschaya, in Lenin's title, is commonly translated as highest or supreme stage, but also frequently understood as last or newest. This shows that there is a latent ambiguity in Lenin's idea, which of course is directly linked to his conviction that imperialism, as I quote, famous definition, the epoch of wars and revolutions, marks the catastrophic end of the development of capitalism as an economic and social formation, therefore opens a messianic moment in which humankind will face the alternative of self-destruction or reconstruction on radically new bases, socialism or barbarism, in Rosa Luxemburg's famous words. It has become very difficult to hold this eschatological vision of history, even and above all, in order to provide an horizon of expectation for revolutionaries, like some of us, who don't accept to view capitalism as the ultimate condition of mankind. But this doesn't mean that the idea of associating a reflection on imperialism with an analysis of stages or successive formations in the history of capitalism is deprived of validity. Far from it. In this respect, very quickly, I will say that two rectifications had to be taken into account, which looked into opposite temporal directions, taking Lenin as a starting point. The first was introduced by the theorists of the capitalist world system, in the words of Immanuel Wallerstein, working with Samir Amin, André Günther Frank, Giovanni Arrighi, etc. It rectifies the idea that the essence of capitalism is entirely contained in the description of its advanced forms in the center, since what is decisive is the relationship of dependency between the center and the periphery, where other modes of production, no less capitalist, but based on different ways of exploiting labor, are prevalent. This dependency, mutual dependency, which is both reciprocal and completely dissymmetric, always existed. It is coeval with capitalism. This means that imperialism is not a late stage in the history of capitalism, but is originary. It's there from the beginning. There was never a capitalism that was not imperialist, even if the forms had to continuously change. Imperialism is therefore not an eschatological notion. It is a concept of variations. This takes us to the rectification. I know I'm very quick. I hope I remain clear enough. This takes us to the rectification on the other side, which we can broadly ascribe, I would say, to a post-Gramscian perspective, inspired by Antonio Gramsci. This is the idea that new epochs or phases in the history of capitalism are characterized by new configurations of classes and class struggles, but also, excuse me, where is also, I'm lost in my text, also separated by moments of uncertainty, what Gramsci called the interregnum, where contradictions can be resolved only through revolutions, which transform the institutional framework of the society. It is here that the idea becomes problematic, but also, I believe, illuminating, because the revolutions can go into opposite directions. Gramsci invented the paradoxical category, think of it, of the passive revolution to describe the effects of the Fordist and Taylorist industrial and commercial reforms, and we may extend it, or it was extended later, to the interpretation of the class compromise that, under the names New Deal in the US and social democracy in Europe, reorganized capitalism with the support of an important fraction of the organized working classes. In view of the more recent neoliberal policies, which began to take shape in the last period of the Cold War, Reaganomics, Thatcherism, and so on, and triumphed at world scale after the collapse of the communist regimes, except in China. This is indeed the key issue. I will go beyond this idea and propose that the transformation of the imperialist capitalist system in the final decades of the 20th century, which conditions our lives today everywhere in the world, was an effective counter-revolution. But counter-revolutions are also revolutions, except, of course, that they are made to restore the hierarchic structure of society, not to turn it upside down. Let me now introduce the category which I use personally with others to define the kind of capitalism in which we live today. I know that it is problematic and the very name may generate ambiguities, but perhaps the risk is worth taking to give maximum salience to the questions involved. I call it absolute capitalism, taking the adjective absolute in a quasi-Hegelian modality which creates an antithesis or a counterpoint with what Wallerstein and his friends had called historical capitalism, the capitalism that coincided with successive forms of the polarity between center and periphery. Why not simply use the name neoliberalism? Because, in my opinion, neoliberalism hints only at some of the characters of the new capitalism, and it suggests, or it tends to suggest, a return to the age-old conflict between economic policies which gave primacy either to state regulations or state initiative or to the market operations, rather than explain how previous forms of antagonism and social conflict have been superseded or even eliminated. My idea is that absolute capitalism must be seen as historically and structurally post-socialist and post-colonial. It is post-socialist because it combines the use of institutions and powers that were elaborated or reinforced during the socialist moment of the world economy with a systematic dissolution of the social rights incorporated in the constitution of the states of the 20th centuries, in very different manners, of course. The post-socialist transformations of the Chinese state, which is increasingly, or seems to be increasingly, leading the transformations of the global system, are, of course, especially relevant here. They are at the same time typical and exceptional. And absolute capitalism is post-colonial because its regime of the generalized commodification of life and its delocalization of productive processes, the so-called global distribution of the value chains, was made possible only by the breaking down of imperial barriers and the opening of peripheral economies to the flows of commodities and capitals that followed the formal decolonization. If we want to try and be more precise, we may draw the attention to certain salient quantitative and qualitative facts. In the globalized economy, social polarization has not been attenuated, despite many discourses and even figures or statistics. Rather, it reaches unprecedented levels with mass poverty and helplessness on one side, and a record, what's the problem? And a record, you're troubling me, and a record concentration of riches and power in the hands of a small, very small minority of financiers on the other side. But its geographic and national distribution is rapidly changing. The borders which separated the world of historic capitalism are redrawn, fractured, and multiplied. Extreme poverty remains concentrated in what we are used to call the South. But the South is also where the new and most aggressive financial and industrial powers have emerged, which makes the idea of an anti-imperialist strategy of the global South based on common interests at least problematic. Conversely, the processes of impoverishment, increasing precariousness, or reproletarianization of the laboring classes, including women, racialized migrant workers, and so on, are gaining momentum in the North, no longer protected by its social state and its imperial privileges, not without social reactions anything but progressive. So there is North in the South, but also South in the North. In other terms, what I argue is that the division of mankind into unequal conditions that characterized capitalism as imperialism throughout its history is there more than ever, but its topography or its geometry, if you allow me this approximation, terminological approximation, is revolutionized. This is not only a new distribution, but a new partition of the world, to which I will return. Allow me to finish on this point by stressing another aspect of the same geometry that makes it possible to underscore the nature of the contradiction that is most dramatic in this new imperialism. Interestingly, it also conjoins the beginnings of the imperialist process with its present outcome. Absolute capitalism, qua dominated by neoliberal monetary policies and financial strategies aiming at maximum short-term profitability, confers, as we know, a central function to the management of the debt, and it's used as an instrument of domination. Different countries and societies clearly occupy antithetic positions in this respect. an enormous amount of debt has completely opposite meaning and effect for dominated economies like, say, Argentina, who lives under permanent threat of bankruptcy, and for the United States, who borrow in their own currency, which they have made the money of the world, enjoying quasi-unlimited possibilities of credit. Most countries are struggling somewhere in the middle with the so-called sustainability of their debts, which is true even for member states of the European Union. But what is the solution that contemporary imperialism offers to heavily indebted countries in order to survive or keep contributing to what Samir Amin called the accumulation at world scale? The answer is certainly complex, and I know I'm not an expert. But one aspect seems hard to ignore. They are continuously pushed back into the kind of extractive economy that was always the specialty, so to speak, of the periphery since the Industrial Revolution and the emergence of carbon technologies. That is, they are the places of destructive production in mining, extensive agriculture and forest exploitation, and the export of raw materials as the low end of the chain value. The environment is destroyed everywhere, but especially, of course, there, where extractive capitalism reigns. This tends to convince me that the fundamental contradiction of contemporary imperialism qua absolute capitalism is to be imagined neither as a pure social contradiction nor as a pure ecological contradiction. It must be analyzed as an antagonistic combination of both. In a striking passage of their Communist Manifesto, Marx and Engels explained that capitalism had reached its absolute limit because, they said, pushing workers below the poverty line in order to increase the profits that their exploitation yielded, it annihilated the main condition of its own reproduction, living labor. The solution, however, was easy to imagine, if not to implement: the expropriation of expropriators, that is, the reappropriation of their means of production by the workers. Now, it is very tempting to identify in the current tendencies of absolute capitalism an even more radical form of self-destruction, because what is continuously annihilated are not only the human lives of the workers, or more generally, the laboring people, but also the environmental or terrestrial conditions without which there is no life at all. When absolute capitalism triumphs, it no longer has a ground on which to operate. In other terms, a territory, an environment, an empire that is firm or stable. Increasingly many humans of different cultures and social conditions are becoming aware of this imminent threat. But the articulation of such an awareness with political movements challenging the inequalities of the world, in the world, local and global, remain, I'm sorry to say, almost unthinkable as long as states and societies keep serving the goal of maximizing profit instead of preserving lives, and no credible program has been devised that would conciliate economic degrowth in a rational manner with eliminating poverty and reducing global inequalities. This would be, of course, a post-imperialist socialism, for which neither the language nor the forces seem to exist or to exist yet. Once again, a very pessimistic conclusion, as you can see. Do I still have a little bit of time? Yes. Thank you so much. Very generous. I will now move to the final question, that of the intersection of culture and imperialism, where my basic reference must be Edward Said. Of course, my intention is not to summarize his work. This is both impossible and unnecessary, because we all know it and make use of its resources in our intellectual activities, each in our way. What I want to do is focus on certain traits of Said's reflection that make it clear, in my opinion at least, why, without the kind of cultural critique that he practiced and inspired, imperialism could not be completely problematized and understood. This derives from the fact that Said never ceased to argue for the idea, as I read him, that literature, the arts, philosophy, historiography are situated, to put it in Sartrean terms. They cannot be independent of the political tendencies and social forces which uphold or challenge a certain hegemony in the society over long periods and through historic revolutions. At the same time, however, Said not only never ceded to social reductionism, but his thought takes us miles away from every idea of a culture that is conceived as an expression or a superstructure in the history of domination. This means that unless we read him in detail, and some others after him, of course, we actually don't know what imperialism means. Or there is something of the essence of imperialism that can be grasped only through his kind of cultural critique. I want to rephrase this in the following manner. Culture, as it is analyzed by Said, is not an expression or an instrument of the domination, the two classical varieties of the idea of superstructure. It is a political mediation in the element of discourse, where enunciation and reception performatively frame their agents, their subjects. Culture immediately also goes with conflict, or even better, with the emergence of a counter-discourse that, in the most important cases, does not remain external to this or that work, piece of writing, but infiltrates, subverts, and modifies its meaning and potential effects from the inside, from within the actions of speaking, writing, reading, interpreting. There are always, a famous expression from culture and imperialism, two sides. I would propose also two voices, even within a single text. Hence, Said's fascinating commentaries of Conrad's picture of colonial violence in Heart of Darkness, or Kipling's betrayal of the irreducibility of India to an object of imperial control in Kim. In a moment, we will have to mention the counterpart of this dialectic on the side of anti-imperialist discourses. As a consequence, the main question becomes how does the mediation of culture orientate and modify the historical trajectory of imperialism, not only at the level of representations, but the level of institutions, through the interactions of its agents with works and discourses that are displayed in the public sphere. This would remain of limited effect if Said's project had been simply to draw a portrait of the ideology of empire as an invariant, a general system of representation, particularly, of course, the representation of the colonial other, the non-European, the potential or actual subject of domination that essentially is valid across, or would remain valid across boundaries, the French, the English empires, and so on, and remains the same throughout the history of colonization. Orientalism, the great book, the founding book, one of these books that are refuted again and again, year after year, and nevertheless, they remain the inevitable reference and starting point. So Orientalism could be read that way for the sake of militant criticism, and also not without examples or cases of perverse reappropriations. Therefore, Said felt the need to add corrections. But examining the whole trajectory, it seems to me that the veritable object of his inquiry was an epochal transformation of the relationship of culture to imperialism over the 2 centuries that lead, say, symbolic references, from the Expédition d'Égypte of Bonaparte and the French Republicans, where the main Orientalist themes are put together in relation with a representation of Europe as an educator of the Orient, to the discourses of American experts, Bernard Lewis, Samuel Huntington, and so on, who already before 9/11 constructed the image of the Arab Muslim as a congenital enemy of modernity, morality, and peace. In the middle, of course, the main object of his analysis, the long examination of the British imperial discourse with its educational, aesthetic, and strategic dimensions. Looking from the end as a vantage point, the trajectory of Orientalism appears as one, I would say quickly, of progressive degeneracy of the internal discursive counterpoints, complexity, as well as obstinacy in the reproduction of the anthropological stereotypes that organically connects the stigmatization of otherness with the management of a world based on the opposition of masters and slaves. Now, this leads quite naturally to asking the question that comes after Said. What kind of phantom life does the imperial discourse maintain when the empires are no longer in construction or expansion, but in decline or dissolution towards a different type of territorial distribution ruled by global finance rather than colonial sovereignty? Before giving a tentative answer, I'm almost done, I ask the permission, nevertheless, of adding another few remarks to this very summary picture of Said's idea of cultural hegemony. First, in the wake of Said's reflection on, you remember the famous piece, Zionism from the standpoint of its victims, I would like to say that a discourse dehumanizing the other becomes all the more necessary when it is a question not of subjecting and exploiting her, but of killing and eliminating her for reasons which belong, it becomes necessary, for reasons which belong to self-justification and the acceptation of oneself, so to speak, even more than to external propaganda. This is tragically illustrated by the discourse of Zionism and its Western lies about the Palestinian people, and more generally by the American scientific discourse about the Arab Muslim other since the Iranian Revolution and the Gulf War at least. But it is not typical of the scholarly and literary productions of Orientalism in the heydays of colonial empires, or it's not the main aspect. Hence a second remark. High culture in the age of imperialism is no less racist than popular or populist culture, but its typical procedure is not to demonize the other, or simply to demonize the other, it is to inscribe racist theorems of hierarchy and difference within a construction of the universal. In other terms, the crowning achievement and the point d'honneur of imperialist culture in its intellectualized forms is to handle a unity of opposites, paradoxically justifying anthropological discriminations and racial hierarchies in the name of a grand narrative of equality and progress, which in counterpart benefits from this dialectical element of negativity, I would put in philosophical jargon. But the brightest example, and I am very attached to, of course, as many of us, to this example, being the Haitian Revolution, the revolution of Toussaint Louverture, we also observe how this contradiction or counterpoint may allow for the possibility of vindicating the universal against its hegemonic uses from the standpoint of the subalterns who now appear, in fact, as the true universalists, often disarmed in terms of military and economic power or might, but endowed with the privilege of speaking truth to power with moral and intellectual consistency. A dialectics that lies at the roots of every movement of emancipation in the 20th century, especially, but not only, in Africa, as expressed by Du Bois and Fanon, both great writers, not by chance. Which leads me to the final remark. I was never convinced by critics of Said who attack his so-called intellectualism or the privilege he grants to literature, philology, scholarship, rhetoric at the expense of popular culture. I think that he was right to emphasize the pervasiveness of the text throughout what we may call the bourgeois imperial era, of which all the major writers discussed by him are representatives, from Flaubert to Camus and Melville to E.M. Forster and Salman Rushdie. Literature is a driving force of bourgeois culture, and bourgeois culture, so Said demonstrates, is always imperial. But this privilege becomes even more important when we turn to the counter-hegemonic discourse from the leaders of anti-imperialist emancipation to the more recent post-colonial scholars and writers. Because it is with the instruments of textuality that they elaborate the typical tensions of their position, seeking a way out of imperialism that is not a new imperialism. For instance, the tensions between nationalism and cosmopolitanism, vindicating identity and vindicating universality. Said, who was an avowed admirer of Goethe's notion of Weltliteratur, world literature, was acutely aware of that tension. He advocated a post-colonial discourse that continues literature, and inverts its effects. This went along with his secularism, since literature is an essentially secular activity, even when it draws inspiration from sacred texts and religious traditions. How do we stand with that today? I think that an hegemonic, I put it very brutally, an hegemonic bourgeoisie in the cultural sense no longer exists, especially at the global level, which is the level that matters. Power there is in the hands of multinational billionaires and their political or technical executives who speak globish and have no interest for literature. They are immune to the effects of counter-discourse. Perhaps it can survive, I hope so, and come alive again in other forms, such artistic practices as Creole writing and music, or transnational pop culture. But there are three, and I would not develop, overwhelming agencies that continuously invade and devour the textual and public space from different angles. First, religious or quasi-religious fundamentalism of every denomination, evangelist, Islamist, Hindu, even laïc à la française. I follow Talal Assad on this point. That transforms conflict into anathema. Then, and I do not develop, the commodification of culture in all its domains. And finally, the digital revolution, which replaces textual elaborations with automatic translations and a standardized generation of messages. Perhaps the second is even more dangerous for a counter-hegemonic enunciation than the first, and the third more dangerous than the second. But in fact, they are combined through the mediation of multinational corporations negotiating their privileges with rising or declining empires. So for the third time, I conclude with ultra-pessimistic diagnosis of the contemporary tendencies of imperialism, generalized war leading to exterminism, absolute capitalism caught in the spiral of deregulated financialization and environmental destruction, imperialist post-culture deprived of its textual oscillation between two sides through the combined effects of the three fundamentalisms, religious, mercantile, technological. Three catastrophes or disasters which do not seem to promise a messianic reversal. Which capacities to resist and open the future do we have in front of them? I don't know. But I wager. For want of place, let me, and I finish, just indicate an orientation of thought. Can I? At a very general level, I believe that there must exist a reciprocity of perspectives between the rebellions against specific imperialist powers the rebellions of the communities or the peoples that they oppress, and the political struggle against imperialism as a system in its totality and its immanent logic. The targeted resistances and rebellions are inalienable because humans are never oppressed by abstractions. They are oppressed by other humans with the help of institutions and armies. But the more general struggle can never be sacrificed because the ultimate defenses of any imperialist power always lie in the relation of what I would call hostile solidarity among them with other imperialisms, which is constitutive of the system. This is true also, and more concretely, because there is a natural tendency, sometimes a vital necessity for any anti-imperialist struggle, to seek support against their particular oppressor on the side of its enemies, which are in fact other imperialists, at the expense of the internationalist alliances with other victims of other imperialisms. And conversely, the whole history of 20th century Africa lies there, perhaps. And conversely, there is a tendency of any imperialism to enroll and manipulate the victims of its adversaries. No imperialism, even the dominant one, in a given period is imperialism as such, or in its totality. A correlative way of addressing this issue of the particular and the universal in the struggle against imperialism resides in the capacity to combine local and global commitments in a single discourse and action. I'm thinking of such strategies as universalizing an emblematic cause, making it a cause for the whole world. For instance, of course, the Palestinian cause, but also the cause of migrants and refugees roaming and dying day after day between hostile borders, especially in the Mediterranean. Or the cause of women brutalized and denied basic rights, absolutely elementary human rights by theocratic regimes, etc. These are only examples. I'm further thinking of constructing transnational networks of resistance, setting up hybrid subjects of several races, genders, nations, who will act together for such common human interests as peace and disarmament, the conservation of the environment, the economic, educational, medical cooperation between the North and the South, the intercultural and interreligious dialogues, etc. Circumventing states and, at the same time, exercising continuous pressure upon them from inside and from outside to orientate their policies. Finally, I want to return to the centrality of the question of the division of the world that I have put at the heart of my presentation of the imperial logic of imperialism, imperialism continuing the history of empires. A division of the world is also a division of humankind, because an essential trait of the human species in evolution and history was to colonize and inhabit the whole planet. I argued with Lenin that the imperialist division was immediately a redivision, a revised or rectified distribution of the territories and the populations, involving most of the time, always in fact, extreme violence. This was repeated several times, and in the 20th century, after the emergence of one military and monetary superpower, followed by its relative decline and contestation by subjects and rivals, it led to a remarkable form of contradictory unification of the world, where the various modes of division and distribution are superimposed: division of alliances and regimes, division of ideologies, distribution of wealth and poverty, distribution of violence, etc. They are superimposed but never exactly matching each other, I would say that this complex pattern creates a partition of the human on Earth. It appears as contradictory, as contradicting a unity that exists as its horizon, but only virtually, in potentia, or that is simultaneously prevented from existing. A missing unity, I would say, with the philosopher Deleuze. This is the general pattern of imperialism in the 21st century, a partition of the unity that never was, but could be, if structural obstacles and power relations were overcome. Overcoming the obstacles to unify the human or reunite the humans with themselves, and probably also with the non-humans that capitalism continuously destroys, does not aim at forming something like a single empire or a universal state. Much the contrary. It aims at promoting a cosmopolitical community of peoples, cultures, and life worlds. Instead of the partition of the human, a counterpoint, I borrow Said's favorite category, a counterpoint of multiple humanities. This is a utopia, of course. But all the anti-imperialist struggles of whichever size taking place around us are contributions to the becoming real of that utopia. The old socialists and communists had proposed the dilemma imperialism or revolution, which also meant only the revolution brings about the closure of the imperialist age. I don't know what the revolution could mean today, but I'm strongly convinced that all the anti-imperialist struggles, with their diverse conditions and modalities, are revolutionary. As Marx had written, I quote with a little adaptation, they are the real movement that abolishes the present domination. In the essential sense, taken together, they are the revolution in the 21st century. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Professor Balibar, for a fascinating lecture. We have time for questions from the audience.
Thank you. Here is a demonic question to break the ice. I've long held a profound reverence for geometry, but ever since it came intertwined with imperialism, that's disquieting. All right. So to build on that and to expand the metaphor, what kind of geometry would you propose to differentiate, or rather predict, the future sphere of imperialism? And here is a metaphorless straightforward question. What would you say some modern forms or instruments of slavery? Thank you.
Okay. It's a comedy, excuse me. I'm gaining time to find the answer. Before I try and say something precise and not too long, and some people know me, when I don't have the answer, I become very long. That was the case today. Okay, two quick indications. First, I was always fascinated by the title and also the content of that little book, in fact, almost forgotten in comparison with his very famous other books, published by Giovanni Arrighi in 1978, The Geometry of Imperialism, because I didn't understand immediately, I would say, in which sense he used the category geometry that could be a pure and rather inadequate metaphor. Then, of course, I returned to the book and I could see that's why I called it a structuralist book. I could see that his intention had been to discuss, which was also my object, of course, variations at the two levels, I would say, of the theories, the discourses on imperialism, starting with Hobson, who is this great man, and at the level of the social and economic structures themselves, in axiomatic terms, I would say. I mean, the book is filled with strange diagrams, arrows, etc. I'm not sure I understand each and every of them, etc. But the latent intention is clear. There's something like a structure, if you like, whose variations can be formalized, so to speak. And in the history of the sciences and the mathematics, this was done particularly by mathematicians studying different so-called geometries. Then, I hope she will not kill me after tonight, my wife, who's a theoretical physicist, was kind enough to read my paper, and she reacted quite harshly before the passage where I wrote the new imperialism that succeeds the colonial distribution of territories among empires. And above all, I summarize that I wouldn't say blur the distinction between the North and the South, but makes it more complicated, more intricate, by making it possible to identify tendencies and powers in the South, which from the economic and political point of view, clearly are of the same kind as the old northern powers, perhaps even more aggressive and powerful. And that's a little complicated, but nevertheless it can be suggested, make it possible to identify in the northern region processes, I would say. I'll speak like Sami Amin, of development of the underdevelopment, which used to be identified with the history of the South. So I wrote, this is a new topography. This is a new topography. It's not just binary. It's not just. And I continued because I had Arrighet in mind, or geometry, meaning it's also a structural variation in the axiomatic, if you like, of imperialism. And my wife said to me, topography and geometry, these are not identical notions. I mean, they are not synonymous. So what is that kind of idiocy, you know? So I have wasted my time to answer you, but you asked the question of slavery. Something that I absolutely did not refer to because I had no place and time, but it's very important in my eyes. In the discussions about the articulation of capitalism and imperialism was brought to the general attention by, for example, the School of Black Marxism and other historians, who explained that the core of the processes of accumulation in the early phases of modern capitalism ought not to be located on the side of the Industrial Revolution in Britain and Europe, but ought to be located on the side of the development and the use of slave labor in the plantations of the Caribbean, Sandy, etc. So in a sense, that amounted to identifying another center that would, and it also went along in the general view with the idea that slavery is a phenomenon that is very strictly, it's fundamental, but it's very strictly located and circumscribed, so to speak, both in time and space. So I'm tempted to suggest, with the help of various readings, etc., and submitting to discussion, of course, that slavery, too, is a phenomenon that is coextensive with the history of capitalism. There was never a capitalism without slavery. But of course, slavery took different forms and targeted different populations. And so to discuss the Atlantic trade, triangle, the famous, etc., in the 17th, 18th, until the beginning of the 19th century, means to study one form of slavery. To move to the question of the coolie labor of Chinese workers and others from East Asia imported to the United States in the early 20th century is another form of slavery in a broad sense, but acceptable sense. And to examine and to discuss the way in which today, both in the North and in the South, perhaps especially in the new centers of capitalist accumulation of the state of the South, the violent commodification of domestic labor involves the massive use and transportation, of course, or deportation of servile labor from other, which is essentially women's feminine labor, from other parts of the world, is another example of slavery. And this is not small. This is not minor. So I come back to my metaphoric use of geometry. There's a structure. There are variations of the structure, and the identification, perhaps the formalization in an ordinary sense of the term, of those variations in the with or without little diagrams, that's not important, is possibly, I would say, a very interesting and useful way of describing the transformations of imperialism. Do I answer your question more? Was too long, I'm sorry.
There was a question here.
She gave me the mic.
Okay, please go,
Okay.
go ahead. You're welcome to ask the question.
Okay. All right. I am Mustafa
And please
El-Sayed.
speak slow and loud,
Okay. Yeah,
because
I
my
speak very
ears
slowly,
are
yeah.
as bad as my eyes.
I am Mustafa El-Sayed. I teach political science at Cairo University, and I taught also political science at the AUC. I have two questions. The first one, how in your scheme, how do you explain the rise of the South? In this, how do you explain the rise of the South? Countries like South Korea, Taiwan, Singapore, how do you explain in your scheme how these countries have succeeded in graduating from the position of the periphery to that of semi-periphery or semi-center? And is there a possibility for other countries to do the same, to graduate also, to become like newly industrialized countries like South Korea, Taiwan, Singapore? This is my first question. My second question is a bit radical.
Is what?
My second question is a bit radical. What do you say to your critics who would say that your scheme is too general? Everything is imperialism. Every culture is bourgeois imperialist culture. Where would you put Edward Said himself? Where would you put Marx? Where would you put Gramsci? Where would you put yourself? Okay, yeah.
Yes,
Yeah, okay.
myself,
Thank you.
no. But, thank you so much for these questions. Okay. Perhaps I'll surprise you, I mean, about the first question. Or perhaps you will say, this guy is not very courageous, or he doesn't... but I feel the need, the necessity to observe, I would say, a certain cautionary or prudent attitude when it comes to discussing such issues as the possible or the tendential displacement of, I'd say, the hegemonic capitalist and imperialist forces of our world from the north to the south or from the west to the east. It's not exactly the same, but the two points often interfere. Now, one of the reasons for that, and that will lead us to the other question, of course, is that I speak myself from the vantage point, I mean, from within the north. I am a pure and typical product of the imperial institutions of this north, this colonial and imperial north. Of course, and I will not go into confessions, I was 20 years old in the last years of the War of Independence of Algeria. I observed that the war is finished with the victory of the Algerian people, but the problems continue. And, so that was a fundamental experience for many people in my generation and and other generations around, because, of course, it forced us, it taught us and forced us to at least try, I would say, to see the world from a standpoint located, so to speak, on the other side. And Fanon's book, The Wretched of the Earth, was published in 1960, immediately censored. So that's part of my experience, and I tried to continue in the same, if you like, militant orientation. But essentially, you cannot become completely other. You are framed and formed by where you come from. And if something is clear, it's that the French universities today in complete disarray and decadence were high, or the British, or high places of bourgeois and imperialist ideology. And when I moved to the United States, it became even worse, if I may say so. So I feel, and put it brutally, I feel that on such subjects, I would, in a sense, prefer to hear the voices from the other side than to speak in their stead. See what I mean? Now all this being said, I find it very difficult to ideas that U.S. capitalism and U.S. imperialism is in decline. I use the expression myself, have been repeatedly announced and proposed for decades. And I've read all the Marxist debates about that. And my friend Immanuel Wallerstein, whom I quoted at least twice, and tonight with whom I wrote a book and from whom I immensely learned, himself wrote that several times. Now American imperialism is declining, and there are circumstances in which it's useful to use that idea. The counterpart, more or less inevitably, being that others are raising. So this does, there are obvious, the fact that the American universal imperialism resorts, it's not the only one, but resorts to extreme violence periodically, and in fact all the time, repeatedly, either Iraq, either directly or indirectly, but give me a break. I mean, Palestine is not indirect. It's not indirect. We know where the bombs are made, and we know why the Israeli state, government, but state, is able to use them. This is with the permission that comes from across the Atlantic. So the fact that they are periodically resorting to violence with effects that probably either immediately, that was the case in different recently, or in the longer term, will prove catastrophic for the US themselves, is not an argument totally satisfying against the idea of decline. The main reason why I said I'm not an expert, I try and learn from what I read. The main reason why the U.S. imperialism is not in decline is is the use of the dollar as the world, as the money of the world, as Marx wrote. So as long as this is not challenged, it could be challenged. It could be challenged either. But I remember when when Europe was full of vain hopes. Oh, soon the euro will compete with the dollar as a reserve, as the a currency of the world. This was never the case. Whether the renminbi will do the job is not clear. Perhaps because the Chinese have no particular interest in. Again, I'm not an expert in trying to impose that alternative. And one of the reasons why they have no interest is their own reserves are huge amounts of dollars and obligations. So you see, so to say that they are in decline is not simple. But to say that others are rising, makes little doubt. And these others are, so China, as I said cautiously 2 or 3 times, is the great problem. Is that the same kind of capitalism that it's a post-socialist capitalism in an even more direct and precise sense as anywhere else in the world. It's a state capitalism, if you like, but okay, I cannot say more. But sorry, I'm too long again. I conclude with that one of the rising powers or the ensembles, the alliances that seemed to be on the rise. I wouldn't say in the plans, but in the tendencies of world economy in the last period was not China or Singapore. It was the so-called Abraham Alliance. It was the combination of Saudi Arabian money and oil, American military, and Israeli technology in the center of the Middle East. Now, what is taking place now, interestingly and problematically, clearly did not wipe out these perspectives. But it also, of course, creates a terrible problem for its realization. Now, as for the second question, I said I would be brief and you should cut me. But for the second question, of course, we were all bourgeois. I mean, if somebody would not deny that he was a bourgeois, that would be Edward, if I may call him with that familiarity, and not because of his elegant costumes, but because of his deep and sophisticated and fascinated interest for the subtleties of the bourgeois culture. But what's interesting is the fact that Said was, in a different manner, not the same, of course, as Gramsci in his prison, or Fanon. I mean, how to find a better example of an intellectual who masters all the elements, I would say, of modern, at his time, philosophical, medical, political culture, as Fanon. So they are all bourgeois, and so am I at a little, etc. But then I did my best to impose this idea in my presentation. I don't know if I succeeded, but what interests Said above all is the inner conflict. it's the inner tension, it's the absolute instability in a sense of this bourgeois high culture. And that works in the two different orientations. That's what makes it so complicated. I said, because on the one side, of course, Du Bois, Fanon and others, the great leaders of anti-imperialists and thinkers of the anti-imperialist struggles in the 20th century, perhaps in the 21st, I'm not sure. They made use continuously of that possibility of reversing or orienting, using the same rhetorical and literary instruments in the other side. But as you know, I don't know if you will agree with that, but that struck me very much when I read Covering Islam and other texts. At some point, Said could not be puzzled, I don't say embarrassed, but shocked by the fact, and I know that I simplify, I'm not just thinking of some Islamist fundamentalists, that some people had read Orientalism and they had drawn the conclusion, and that's very powerful these days as well, drawn the conclusion, the West describes us, the Muslims, the Arabs, the Indians, the Chinese, as wholly other. But we are wholly others. And we will prove that this is not our weakness. This is not only the way in which the West constructs our and imagines our identity. This is the way in which we identify with our difference and make it a powerful instrument of resistance and etc. So he was caught by surprise. That was my impression, to some extent, of course. And that's where, of course, the whole issue of secularism in its broad sense came to the fore. But that led him, I think, and if you read the text, it's very clear for me, not to abandon his analysis, but to add, I would say, a more explicit and additional element of conflictuality, and if you like, ambiguity or ambivalence in his discourse. So in Covering Islam, it's very interesting because I wrote about that a long time ago. It's framed in terms of conflicts of interpretations, frames of interpretations. Okay, I was.
Thank you. We have a question. Yes.
Thank you very much, and thank you for a very rich and stimulating lecture. As an old friend of Edward Said, that I have the fortune of knowing him for many years, I'm so pleased to see that we are still having a continuous debate with his theories and his ideas and so on. And I'm glad that a large part of this lecture returned after a very global, almost trip around the world with Wallerstein and many others. But the most interesting things that I can see now is that you used the Gramscian term of the interregnum.
Of the interregnum, yes.
Interregnum, and we are actually in that state of interregnum when the old is dying and becoming more brutal than ever. And that is why in the grip of that decline, we see the brutality that demonstrates itself now in our region, in Lebanon and in Palestine. And to a certain extent, you more or less confirmed that imperialism is in decline. But this decline will not be that easy or that fast in any way. And that is why our region here is paying a very heavy price for that. However, one of the things that interested me that the absence of deluge from your lectures. When many of the ideas of the rhythm and of how all of these different forms that come connected in a completely different way at a different level could constitute a much more powerful form of resistance. What do you think?
Forgive me, I hope I will answer your question at least, does it work? Yes, at least broadly or as I said, my ears are not good, so I'm not sure that I understood everything that you said, which is not your fault, but mine. Okay, so let me try. My perception, and I might say our perception, because I think that this is something that is very general, very broadly shared in today's critical discourse. My perception of what Gramsci wanted to do and succeeded in doing has profoundly changed in the last period. As I reread, and I hope not to become sentimental, but the more I was learning, and others as well, about the circumstances in which Gramsci wrote these texts that you allude to, the more I was becoming aware that there were tragic dimensions to that and stakes which for us are impossible to deny. When you learn, I'm sorry if again I seem to wander around the question now. When you learn that Gramsci in the prison where he had been sent by the fascist Italian regime, with Mussolini famously saying, we must prevent that brain, that mind, from thinking for 20 years or so. When we learned that, we discovered that Gramsci in the fascist prisons was isolated not only from the external world, the real life, by his wardens and by the fascists, but also quarantined by his own comrades, following the orders of Stalin, of the Comintern, because already at that moment he was supposed, and of course that was very easy in the period, to be deviant, to be a heretic, to have sympathies for Trotsky, which was never the case, and so on and so on. You begin to understand that, to put it again very brutally, I come from a variety of Marxism. You generously referred to I do not renege my master and friend Althusser, but our Marxism was both intellectually very formalistic and politically very dogmatic. So we had a tendency at the time to see Gramsci as the one who proposes a kind of more reformist equivalent for the idea of the dictatorship of the proletariat or the transition from capitalism to socialism. The interregnum has nothing to do with that. Now, when Gramsci writes the famous, there's one sentence about the interregnum that now, there was a time some years ago when I thought, oh, I will refer to Gramsci's notion of the interregnum. That's exactly what it's. Today, everybody refers to the interregnum, but anyway, when you read the famous phrase, remember, I quote off memory, but it's more or less that. In moments of interregnum, the old medieval category that refers to the moment when the king or the caliph is dead and the new one is not crowned, etc. So in the moment of interregnum, when he writes, the old, in general, is already dying, and the new is not yet formed and concretized or crystallized. All sorts of pathological phenomena, political, of course, pathological phenomena emerge, and somehow we are lost in them. And what are these pathological phenomena? Fascism, of course, in his day, but Stalinism as well, of course. That is not only the brutal, the violent, counter-revolutionary suppression and assaults, but also the tragic degeneracy of the communist revolution, the tragic transformation of the revolution into, in a sense, its opposite. That is something like a counter-revolution under revolutionary cloth. You may imagine that. But the formula is interesting because it speaks of the old and the new. So Gramsci is more than ever thinking, and that makes him a communist, of course, and not a skeptic like me or others. He's still believing that there is something like a course of history, a general tendency that leads from the old exploitation to the new emancipated society. So he has not yet completely abandoned his faith, I would say, in the truth of Marx's formula. If Marx ever wrote something that proves wrong, it's that. 1859 preface to the contribution. Humankind never poses problems that it is not, faces problems that it is not able to resolve. Because if you look more closely at the situation, you will see that the germs of the solution are already there within the contradictions, etc. That's the teleological view of history. So Gramsci is not completely rid of that. But then if you look at the categories that he tries to elaborate, and that's why on purpose I quoted, you find this incredibly paradoxical, oxymoronic category, passive revolution. He did not invent the formula, he took it from an Italian writer. But what is a passive revolution? That is a transformation, active by definition, or of the institution, the world that is not achieved, I would say, by the will and the strength of the progressive classes, etc., but the forces of the old world itself. The old world proving able to renew, to transform itself, in order, in fact, to prevent the revolution from taking place by means of a counter-revolution or another. So these are highly ambivalent categories, but also at the same time profoundly dialectical categories, I believe. And they draw our attention to the fact that we live in situations where the only certainty that we have, it's a negative certainty, is that the world cannot not change, cannot not change. But the direction in which it will change for the predictable future is entirely open. So that's, in a sense, for the old revolutionaries that some of us were, a very worrying perspective. But on the other hand, it's also, it has some good sides. I finish with that. My friend Wallerstein for years wrote, he was a great master of pedagogy, not me, writing for a broad audience. He said, the capitalist world system, like every system, is entering a structural crisis. This will lead to a situation of high instability with pathological phenomena, violence everywhere, wars, etc. Times of trouble. Where will this lead? I was always laughing at that, you know, and I made fun of him. This will lead either to a liberation of the world from the capitalist system, or it will lead to another system. But that system will be either worse or better than capitalism. And if you ask me about the chances, I would say 50-50 in it. So for a long time, you know, I thought Monsieur de la Palice would not say better. I mean, this is a complete tautology. The new will be either better or worse. But then I came to the conviction that this was a good allegory. 50 chances that it's better, 50, etc. Now, of course, the discourse I propose today seems to indicate that the chances for this world to be worse are 99%, and the chances for this world to be better are 1%. But 1% is not nothing.
Thank you. I think we have time for 2 questions. You had a question.
Thank you so much for speaking. My question is, I guess, more of a practical one. Sorry, my question is more of a practical one. So a practical question. It's less academic, maybe. But you spoke of how the the metropole and the bourgeoisie get to decide sort of what is within the bounds of laws of war, and what is barbaric, and also what they also decide what is otherized, such as with the case of Islamist politics since the 1970s, or since the no. Do you understand? No. Should I use? Yeah. Okay. Sorry. Yeah. Sorry. Is this better? Okay. Is this better? Okay. Sorry. My question is in relation to. Sorry. My question is in relation to how you spoke about the role of the West being both the metropole and the sort of high culture in deciding and in framing how Islamist politics is otherized since the Islamic Revolution in Iran. And what I find striking today, specifically in relationship to Gaza, is how I think we see how in a world where I feel like practical solidarity and also ideology is largely dead in politics, Islamist political groups manage to maintain that. And so what I mean by that is we see, for example, how in Afghanistan, the Taliban managed to unite. In Afghanistan, the Taliban managed to unite cross-tribal solidarity in a fight against US imperialism. I think we see that also in how both Hamas and Hezbollah engage Christian groups in their politics and in their monetary work or developmental work. And also how we see how Iran is able to unite Islamist groups from Yemen, how Iran is able to unite groups from Yemen to Lebanon, back to Iran. It's essentially the Arab Peninsula. And I think we also see how this ideology of the need for Islamic unity. I think it's unique in the way it's able to be practiced. And my question is, in your final concluding remarks, you recommended that religious politics and you specifically mentioned Islamism, how that should be left out of anti-colonial struggles or out of, so my question is, how do you reconcile that concluding remark with what you said before and how we see Islamist politics and its role in the world today? But also, how should the West realign its relationship to Islamist groups and Islamist political movements in that light? Thank you. I hope that makes sense.
Sorry, I make it complicated for you.
Should I try to reformulate?
No, please, let me
sorry.
try. I said that I was not convinced by an argument, which perhaps I'm inventing, but I don't think so, not completely. Criticizing Edward Said's interpretation of notice that the title of his great book is Culture and Imperialism. It's not imperialist culture or culture of imperialism and so on. So I said that I was not convinced by a critique that, again, perhaps I'm inventing or simplifying. Let me put it like that. That simply would say something like, oh, dear Edward is not a sociologist. So if you read his books, Orientalism and Culture and Imperialism, you find beautiful, extraordinary readings of literature that include, for example, Jane Austen, to show that despite the seeming, not limitation, of course not, but orientation of her writing towards the intimate analysis of passions and family relations and so on. She has a relationship to the empire. Or Heart of Darkness. I always return to his reading of Heart of Darkness and his controversy with with certain other decolonial critics, Chinois, Abebe, etc., etc. I think he's absolutely right to explain that that we must understand what made Conrad able in the parallel or counterpoint of Kurtz and Marlowe to express something about what I have attributed to Schmidt, the qualitative difference of violence waged among the colonizers and against the colonized. But these are all texts, as he writes, text, writers, literature. And please, Mr. Said, would you suggest to us that the ideological power or the hegemony of the British or the French imperial empires, the colonies in India or in Africa relied on the power of literature? I mean, would the colonial employees, officials, soldiers, merchants, etc., have been trained in high culture? Of course not. So the massive ideological bases of that domination are to be looked at, I would say, more basic and rudimentary levels. Now, a first answer, a possible answer to that could be Said is firmly convinced that there are structural elements, or better, internal antagonisms affecting the ideology of empire that are never brought to the fore, made visible, except in literary texts and writing. I'm sensitive to that because a long time ago, and sorry if I seem to refer to myself, but I had written in defending my own discipline, philosophy, and even history of philosophy, reading Kant, Hegel, which is not so completely different from reading Kipling or reading Melville. So I had written a certain intrinsic, immanent antinomies or conflicts or contradictions, okay, if you prefer, of the dominant ideology are brought to the fore and made explicit by the philosophical discourse, which in this respect has no equivalent. So that is a mild way of addressing the critique of the argument. And why not accept that the ideological domination of bourgeois worldview, of the bourgeois worldview, in the era of imperialism, classical imperialism, has to be investigated on a broader basis and in other places as just text. Now there's an interesting intermediary between the sociological inquiry and the literary criticism that Said practiced very systematically and for the sake, of course, of his political struggle. That's the press and the discourse of the press covering Islam. Therefore, the communicative, I would say, system that creates in the bourgeois era what famously Habermas and others have called the bourgeois public sphere. I think that Said is a very effective analyst, and that's where he, of course, he differs from Habermas and others, because Habermas and others have a completely normative view of that. They explain what makes the public sphere so important in the bourgeois era is the general acceptance or the virtual acceptance of such normative principles, which in fact are moral principles of the kind, we must accept the diversity of the conflicting opinions in order to resolve the conflicts at the level of argument and not the level of punching, etc., etc. Whereas Said's description is not normative. It's not normative. It's a description of the actual conflict or relationship of forces in that discursive field. But then I come again to my question. I'm very obsessed by that in this moment, and I'm aware that I need to learn more and know more and discuss with other people. I'm less and less convinced that this public sphere really exists or still matters. I'm afraid that we are living in times where the conflict of ideas, if you like, be they conservative or progressive and revolutionary, is losing relevance, is decaying, and in that kind of environment, of course, this cannot be perceived from here, because here we are in the heart, in the core of the institution, where ideas, discourses, arguments, and tropes, I would say, or literary metaphors still matter. And for that reason, Said's description of the two sides, the counterpoint, the counter discourse from within the dominant, etc., is something of value and influence. And of course, if it's you who asked, if I had time, I would try and jump from there to the very dramatic situation that you allude to. When we see the genocide, no doubt this is a genocide. But I'm caught in France, as you possibly are in the US, and almost certainly in disputes about which name to use to describe what is the... and so not only we find ourselves deprived of the political instruments that would really impact the situation. If these instruments existed, they would have been used for months. And maybe I'll say something that will raise objections. But the instruments to stop the genocides are not the Iranian missiles. I'm not against their use, that's not my problem. But they're not stopping the genocide, and they're not going to stop the genocide. So apart from the question of the political, military and militant forces that we could put before the tanks and the airplanes and the missiles. There are also, of course, there's also, of course, the question of the ideological and intellectual arguments. And the arguments do exist. They do exist. But they are ineffective. They're ineffective. That to vote a law in the Knesset that bans United Nations, humanitarian organizations from helping, from accessing the Palestinians is one more strike or draw in the process whose meaning is completely clear. It's like the Warsaw Ghetto. I mean, you enclose the population in behind walls, etc., and then you kill them inside the etc., to make room, etc. So that this contradicts every internationally accepted legal and humanitarian legal discourse. This is absolutely plain. It is absolutely plain. Which effect does it have to say it? Now, one of the reasons, again, I'm perhaps crossing not the red line, but the line of what I can demonstrate. The reason for that is the inter-imperialist conflict at world scale. I totally agree with the idea that Europe and the West use a double standard in matters of humanity, of wars and massacres. That's absolutely plain. But then this argument coming from the so-called global South has a limit. It has and the limit is, where do we see forces in this world belonging to other alliances or than the US, Israeli, European, with a few exceptions, alliance that would effectively start to challenge this, and they are not doing it. China is not doing it, and they are not doing it because they have their own interests in the situation. Okay.
Okay, I think this brings us to the end, and you can ask questions after the lecture. Thank you so much, Professor Balibar, for a rich lecture, very rich lecture. And thank you so much for